So this is our second lesson on Congress, and we're going to talk today about the powers of Congress. We're going to talk about the enumerated powers, basically the things that only Congress can do, which is amend the Constitution and create laws, and then the implied powers of Congress, which are those things that are not directly stated in the Constitution. Let's start with constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments and laws are often confused by students. Constitutional amendments make the Constitution better. Think of the word mend. You mend a dress or you mend a bone, you're making it better. That's what constitutional amendments do. They strengthen the Constitution. The Constitution is the framework from which laws are made. So, for example, the constitutional amendment of free speech, okay, that's guaranteed in your First Amendment, free speech. Well, the law that's created from that would be something like not forcing public school students to engage in prayer, right? You can't force them to pray in schools. That would go against your First Amendment, your First Amendment right. There's only 27 constitutional amendments, so it's very difficult to change the Constitution, and the Founding Fathers did this on purpose. They didn't want the Constitution to be a document that any president or any person who came into power could just change very easily. The first 10 amendments were written almost directly after the Constitution, and of course that's your Bill of Rights, and then over the entire course up until now, there's only 27 total. So how do you amend the Constitution? It's a two-part process, and the first part of the process is to create a proposal, and that proposal has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate and the House, so by a supermajority. Now that proposal can also be approved by calling a convention of the states. However, that's never been done, so we're not going to focus on that. If the proposal is approved by 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House, it then has to go to the states, because remember federalism, we have national government and we have state governments. So once the national government has approved the proposal is sent to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to approve the proposal. So it has these huge hurdles to overcome. It has to overcome fighting in the Senate and the House at a very large majority, and then it has to overcome large fighting in the states. So California and Texas and New York, they all have to agree before the Constitution can be amended. But if it does pass those two things, then the Constitution can be changed. So what about laws? Congress is the only body that can make laws. I'm sure you're familiar with basic laws against stealing and murder, but think about all the other kinds of laws there are. There's accident laws, injury laws, business laws, civil rights laws, consumer laws, and on and on and on. Now, laws are not static, right? They don't stay the same. It's really interesting to look at different laws that are on the books like a long time ago. For example, it used to be on the South Carolina books that every adult male must bring a rifle to church on Sunday in order to ward off Indian attacks. Obviously, we can see the need for that law then, but now we're discussing not even having guns and gun laws changing and restricting a person's right to have a gun. Some of the funny ones are like it used to be legal or illegal to keep a horse in a bathtub. Have no idea why that was a law. You might want to take a look and just look at some of the laws that used to be on the books. It can be kind of interesting. So how are laws made? I'm sure you're all been introduced to that great Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill, and the simple way of introducing a bill into Congress, getting it passed by both the House and the Senate, and then signed by the President. That's the middle school answer. We're going to look at this a whole lot more in depth and really understand how a law gets made. So laws begin as ideas, okay? These ideas can come from you, they can come from me, they can come from all laws in the United States begin as bills. So before a bill can become a law, it has to get approved by both the House and the Senate, and then the President. So laws begin as ideas, and these ideas can come from anyone. They can come from you, they can come from me, they can come from your mom. And once a bill is put together, it has to get introduced. Now, it can get introduced into the House or the Senate, unless it has to do with money. Anything that has to do with money has to be introduced into the House. Once it is introduced, it is put into, there's a hopper, and it is given a letter, HR, if it's introduced in the House of Representatives, S, if it's introduced into the Senate, and then it's given a number. So all the bills go into the hopper. They are not immediately put onto the House floor or the Senate floor for debate. Before they do that, they have to go to committees. So the committee looks at the bill. And sometimes these committees are broken down even further into subcommittees. So this is a group of House members or a group of senators, not the entire House floor, not the entire Senate floor. So maybe 10 or 15 people, or if it's a subcommittee, maybe 5 people. And basically what they're doing is they're looking at this bill and saying, is this a good idea? Is it not a good idea? And they're debating on whether it even needs to go to the House floor for a vote. So this is why committees are so important, because they decide what is going to be voted on. So if you are a senator, you want to be on committees that look at important bills. So if you were on a budget committee or a education committee, you're only going to look at bills that have to do with education, or only have to do with things that have to do with the budget. And remember, we talked about senators and their seniority. The more senior you are, the better the committee you get. So if your bill makes it through committee, it then goes to the House floor or the Senate floor to be voted on. So let's say that you started your bill, it got through the committee, and now it's on the House floor, it gets voted on, and it passes. So now it goes from the House to the Senate. It doesn't go to the Senate floor, it goes to the Senate's committee. In the Senate committee, it looks at all of what the House did, and it may decide that it's great, and it may send it to the floor and then vote on it. But more than likely, it will not. The committee will look at what the House sent and say, well, no, this is good, this is bad. After the committee looks at it, then they will send it to the Senate, and the Senate will vote on that. But it has changed. The bill that the Senate is looking at is not the same bill that the House sent. So if the Senate looks at the bill and says, yes, this is good, and votes on it, then it sends it back to the House. Now the House will look at that bill, vote on it, send it back to the Senate. Senate will vote on it. The goal is that the Senate and the House have to vote and say yes to the exact same bill. So once they've agreed, it can then go to the President. And then the President has the choice of signing it and vetoing it. We'll look at that in more detail. So most of the work on bills is actually done in committees. And there are what they call standing committees, and these are committees that exist all the time. Things like the Appropriations Committee. Appropriation Committee is people that look at bills only having to do with where money is spent. So of course that's a pretty powerful committee. You want to be on that committee because you get to determine where money goes and what things get spent. Budget, same sort of thing. Armed services, if you have a high interest in the military, you might want to be on the Armed Services Committee. And then, of course, there are also subcommittees that maybe, you're a first-term senator or a first-term congressman, you might get put on a subcommittee. Something happens in these committees when they're marking up the bills and deciding what to do and what not to do. This is where what happens is called pork barrel spending, or earmarks. And this is when senators and congressmen put in funds that bring money to a specific representative's district. Basically, it's the politician trying to benefit his or her supporters by giving them money, like, writing in a line, oh, well, we get $500,000 to support some sort of museum in my district. This is called pork barrel spending, or earmarks. So, for example, the National Institute of Health spent $387,000 given to them by the government for Swedish massages to rabbits. This was something that was put into a bill as a part of pork barrel spending. So take a look at some of the pork barrel spending that gets put into laws in committees. So when a bill is in the House, it has to go through a certain procedure, and this is where the House Speaker or the leader of the House is so very important. Because there are 435 members, you can't just send a bill to the floor. It gets rowdy. There has to be rules. It's kind of chaotic. Imagine trying to call a vote in a classroom of 30 students and trying to get everyone to agree, okay, are we going to eat pizza or are we going to go to Subway? And there's no teacher to tell them, okay, let's take a vote. So with 435 people, they have to have a leader, and that leader in the House is called the Speaker of the House, and he's very important. He's actually third in line for the presidency. If the president would die, the vice president would take over, but if the vice president were to die, the House Speaker would take over. So he has a very important job, but he is also important because he sets the agenda on what is going to be heard. So he looks at these bills that have gone through the committees and they're now ready to be voted on, and the House Speaker can decide, no, we're not going to look at that this term, we'll look at it next term. Okay, he can table it, he can set it to the side. He sets the agenda and the rules. He can also decide whether if a bill if it's voted on, whether it can be amended. He can say, no, if you're going to vote on this, it has to be as is, no amendments. Or he can say this, it can be amended even after we vote on it. So the previous speaker was John Boehner, and the current speaker is Paul Ryan. Now the speaker is chosen by the party in power. So the party in power right now is the Republicans, because there are more Republicans in Congress than Democrats. That changes. If after an election there are more Democrats, then you're going to have a Democratic speaker. But right now the House is controlled by Republicans. Rules for the Senate as well. However, the Senate being a little bit more civilized, or really just less people, there aren't as many rules. Now, there's a very strange rule in the Senate, and it's called the filibuster. Now, when a senator gets up to talk about a bill and why people should vote for it, it is rude to interrupt the person speaking. So, as long as that person is speaking, there cannot be a vote. So, if there's something that a certain group or a certain person doesn't want to be voted on, he can just continue speaking. This was made famous by Senator Strom Thurmond, who spoke for a whopping 24 hours with just a minor potty break on a bill. So they're not speaking about the bill. You don't have to continue talking about the bill. They can be about anything. They can be reciting recipes. They can be singing gibberish. As long as they are standing and don't stop talking, a vote cannot be taken. There is something called cloture. You can end a filibuster by voting on the bill with cloture. However, that means you have to have 3/4 of the Senate agree, and of course, that very rarely happens. Can you get that many people to agree on a vote? The vice president is technically head of the Senate. So the vice president has his feet in both branches. He has his feet in the executive branch and his feet in the legislative branch. But his role in the legislative branch is very much ceremonial. He really doesn't do a whole lot. He can vote on a bill if it is tied. All right, so let's say we are now past the committees, and we have passed the House, and we have passed the Senate. So now we have finally arrived at the president's desk. Are we a law yet? No. The president does have the ability to veto it. He can say, nope, I don't like it, we're not going to do it. So you can see it's difficult to get laws passed. The president does have the option of leaving it alone. If he doesn't want his name attached to this bill, to this law, he doesn't want to be like, I will be forever remembered as the president that signed this into law. He has the option of just leaving it alone, and after 10 days, it goes into law by de facto. Okay, he doesn't have to sign every law. After 10 days, it just happens. Now, what if it goes the other way, and he wants to veto it, but he doesn't want to be the president that didn't let it happen? he can do something what's called a pocket veto. Because Congress and Senate have sessions, and they're not always in session, right? They are not always in Washington. If Congress closes, if Congress is not in session, and a bill has not been signed within 10 days, then it's pocket vetoed. It's automatically vetoed, and it has to go all the way through the whole process again. So there's a way for a bill to become law without him signing it, and there's a way for a law to become vetoed without him vetoing it. If the president vetoes it and the Senate and the House can agree, 2/3 of both houses, they can override the president's veto. However, that doesn't happen very often. All right. So it is more complicated than just, Congress passes it and then going to the president. There's a lot of steps involved. This is a sort of a flow chart. You can look up several different versions of this on the internet, and it's helpful to see all the different processes. What happens if they say yes, and what happens if they say no, and where does it go from there. Make sure that you are familiar with all of the different steps in a bill becoming a law. So we looked at the expressed or enumerated or delegated or constitution, whatever you want to call the powers that are stated in the Constitution, making laws. Let's look at the not stated or the implied powers of Congress. So the other type of power is implied. Implied powers are the ones that are not stated directly, they're implied. So what does the word imply mean? So dictionary.com says involved, indicated, or suggested without being directly or explicitly stated, tacitly understood. So it's basically, it just means that you understand it even though you're not saying it. So let's try understanding implied this way. Look at this sentence. I went from my bedroom to the kitchen. All right, so how did you get there? Well, this sentence implies that you probably walked from your bedroom to the kitchen, right? I mean, you could have flied, but it's implied that you walked. Or, how did you get there? Through the door? It's implied that there would have been a door between the bedroom and the kitchen. There could have been a window, there could have been, you could have punched your way through. It's implied that you walked through a door to get to the kitchen, even though it's not stated. That's what implied means. So how is implied used for constitutional powers in Congress? So after the Constitution is done listing all the things that the Congress can do, coin money, declare war, etc., there's a phrase, and it's the most controversial phrase in the Constitution, and it says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department office thereof. This is called the necessary and proper clause. And basically, it implies that Congress has the ability to do all of these other things. So, for example, Congress has the enumerated power to raise an army. So if Congress has the power to raise an army, doesn't it seem necessary and proper that this army should be filled with a national draft? Nowhere in the Constitution does it say Congress can create a draft. No. But it's implied that if it needs to raise an army, it could have a draft. You see what I'm saying? It's implying it because it's necessary, and I'm using air quotes, you can't see me, necessary and proper. Okay? So this gets hazier as we go on, because it states that things like, the Constitution states that Congress has the power to regulate commerce. Okay, well, there's a lot of powers that can be implied as necessary and proper to regulate commerce. Well, what about the Congress's stated obligation to protect the general welfare? That includes a lot of implied powers. So, for example, if Congress is given the expressed or stated power of regulating commerce, can't Congress imply that there is a minimum wage? We've already discussed this, McCulloch versus Maryland, when we were looking at state versus federal power and how now federal power always sort of trumps state power. But this case also involves this idea of implied powers and the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. The necessary and proper clause is also called the elastic clause because it stretches the Constitution, right? It allows the Constitution to grow and expand. Think about your pants. If you add an elastic, you need some elastic after Thanksgiving. Let it grow. Because the bank, right? Congress wanted to create a national bank. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that it doesn't say Congress shall make a bank. But it does say that they can control taxes. So isn't it implied that if the government is going to collect taxes, that it would be necessary and proper to have a bank? Okay, so McCulloch versus Maryland also confirms and establishes this idea of the elastic clause and implied powers. Now this is where parties differ a lot, and this will come when we start looking at different political parties. It has a lot to do with how you interpret the necessary and proper clause and how you determine the growth of government. Because with the necessary and proper clause, this is where you get huge amounts of government growth. Almost all government growth has come out of the necessary and proper clause, and Congress establishing all of these different things from this clause. So we get two different ideas that come out of this. Strict constructionists. Strict constructionists tend to lean towards only enforcing the delegated, the enumerated powers. So if the government says, hey, we want to create a bank, strict constructionists would say, nope, it does not state it. Then you have the other flip of the coin where loose constructionists look at it and say, well, we have these implied powers from the necessary and proper clause. We need to collect taxes. We need a bank. That would be a loose constructionist. So you have strict constructionists versus loose constructionists over this idea of Congress's implied powers.